Hi, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here in just a minute. Thanks for joining us. Good morning, everybody. We'll give a couple more seconds and then we'll go ahead and get started with some housekeeping items. Thanks for joining us today. Alrighty, so welcome to today's webinar, Landlord Engagement Virtual Summit, Leveraging Funding Sources for Housing Solutions. We appreciate you all being here today. The Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania is a statewide coalition working to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable homes for all Pennsylvanians. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join us. You can do that by visiting our website or contacting us at info@housingalliancepa.org. Today's webinar will run for approximately an hour and a half. If you have any questions for the presenters, please utilize the Q&A function that will be at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions about logistics for Housing Alliance staff, please use the chat function, and we will be sending you a copy of all presentation materials and the recording shortly after today's presentation. Please save the date for our 20th annual Homes Within Reach conference, December 4th through the 6th. It will take place in person at the Hershey Lodge in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And then to stay up to date on upcoming webinars, visit our events page where you can register for all of our events. And then I really encourage you to check out some of our resources and reports related to landlord engagement. We have a pretty robust landlord engagement resource library. We just put out a new fact sheet, lessons learned from landlord incentive pilots in 3 communities. And we have the results from our recent landlord survey where we surveyed over 660 landlords. So check those out and let us know if you find those useful. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Gail Schwartz, our Director of Programs and Outreach. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am just getting all of my screens sort of situated here. Let me share. Great. So I want to thank you all for joining today's Landlord Engagement Virtual Summit. The Housing Alliance goal is to create more permanent housing options for families that have experienced homelessness. And the purpose of today's event is to discuss financial resources and services for housing location and engagement strategies to persuade landlords to rent to tenants with multiple barriers to housing, served through the homeless assistance programs. And really, how do you fund those programs and services? So we have a really, really great panel today. We are going to be joined by state, federal, local experts on, different resources that can be leveraged, that can be braided together to really help us create robust housing location and landlord engagement strategies. So we have Amy Seacrest, Senior Policy Officer with the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, Brendan Allman from an economic development consultant with DCED. We have Joe Savage from our senior regional advisor from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And we have Kaylin Charlton, Vice President, CRA Strategic Program Manager with Truist Bank. So the first thing that we have is, now that you know who we are, we want to know who you are. are you a homeless assistance provider, including all of the rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, shelter providers out there? Do you do more work with the continuum of care leadership and help administer the system? Are you some other kind of homeless service, or I'm sorry, human service provider? Do you work with housing redevelopment authorities? Are you with philanthropy? Are you yourself a landlord or property manager or community group, grassroots advocates, or something else? So we'll just give you about, I don't know, 30 seconds to go ahead and just give us a quick glimpse on who's in the room with us. Jen, I'm going to rely on you to let us know when it's good to share. Great. We're seeing mostly homeless assistance providers, which is great. We're seeing some COC leadership. I also see a strong group of other human service providers, as well as grassroots and community groups. And, of course, folks from all across the spectrum who are invested in, making sure there is safe, decent, affordable housing options for everybody. So thank you all for joining us today. So why are we here, right? Why do we need to talk about this? Housing location for families and individuals overcoming homelessness was never easy. But with the surge in demand for rental housing, it has become exponentially more challenging. And this high demand means that the market will support landlords being as picky as they want. And the Housing Alliance surveyed over 660 landlords, and what they told us is that landlords really aren't going to rent to people with past evictions, who do not have any source of income, do not have any involvement in the criminal justice system, particularly for violent crime. So we know, folks particularly being served, most certainly not all of them, but a lot of them, there's income troubles. There's maybe a history of past eviction. There's maybe been some involvement with, criminal justice system or other institutional settings. So the people that are being served through these programs really do have some barriers to housing. And with landlords having the pick of anybody, it is becoming harder. And in that same survey, landlords also told us that they're kind of struggling to as well. We are seeing landlords reporting more tenant management issues, struggling to meet their own financial obligations, more maintenance and repair needs, staffing issues, and some generally don't even want to be a landlord anymore. And one of the things that really became apparent is that when we looked at the landlords who were smaller in scale, who are far more likely to work with these housing assistance programs, that they are disproportionately more likely to be struggling to meet their own financial obligations and no longer to wish to be a landlord. And I think that this is important to note because, when people are afraid they can't make their bills, they get very, very risk adverse. And that can really feed into some business decision making that may be more rooted in stigma and just make things even harder for folks who may not look so great on paper to rent an apartment. But there is hope. The one thing that has never changed when it comes to the market is, what is the common interest between all of us? What is it that homeless and housing assistance providers and clients and landlords all have in common? And we all want stable and lasting tenancy. We want to make sure that our clients who are the tenants are set up to be successful, be able to maintain their home, get along well with the neighbors, that rent is paid on time, and that people are able to stay in the same unit for years at a time. And that's to the benefit of landlords too. Every year that a landlord doesn't have to re-rent their unit, um, it ends up, being to their benefit. So what do we need to be successful? We need a housing location infrastructure. Safe, decent rentals that are at a price programs can work with are becoming harder and harder to find. So when one becomes available, we as a system need to move quickly and efficiently to make sure it gets rented to the families that truly need it the most. And just like, we have coordinated entry when it comes to homelessness systems, and it's really a separate component compared to all of the actual case management services. I like to think that's how we should think about housing location too. Those who have been working in homelessness services for a while may remember, we moved to a system of coordinated entry where all service providers in a community now share one master wait list. And just like with coordinated entry, there is going to need to be a separate infrastructure if we are going to have kind of a master list for landlords and for units. But luckily, anybody who was there when your community had to implement coordinated entry, implementing a housing location infrastructure is going to be so much easier. So looking at the key components of that infrastructure, we really want to make sure that we have a process for connecting clients to available housing opportunities, right? Because everything that we do is in service of getting people into a place, into a home of their own that they can stay in for long term, even after services have ended. So, that looks at moving costs, helping fill out applications, getting utilities set, all of that stuff. But there also needs to be having devoted capacity. That means resources and staff who are skilled in real estate or property management and all of that to really do this continuous tracking of landlords and units, and moving away from the practice of waiting until you have a new client enrolled in your program to start doing the housing location piece. So now, going back to the survey that I had mentioned earlier, there are a number of strategies out there for landlord engagement, and we asked landlords what they wanted when working with programs. And a few key trends emerged in their answers. They want reliable communication and preferably with the same person. They are concerned about risk, and risk is not just about damage or tenants not being able to pay rent, but there's also about loss of income because of delays that come with working with the bureaucracy of housing assistance programs, as well as maybe there's an unanticipated repair that they weren't quite budgeted for as a result that was found during an inspection, something of that nature. And after we asked landlords what they wanted, we actually kind of tested it. So the Housing Alliance was able to provide 3 pass-through grants to communities, just a small amount, $25,000 each, with the help of Kaylin on today's call. So we're really grateful for Truist. And we saw some really, really amazing things happen. We saw families experiencing homelessness moved into their own homes faster after programs started offering landlord incentives. And by pretty dramatic gains. Each of the communities most certainly did a different approach to how they wanted to have their programs look, whether it was a simple sign-on bonus and sign-on bonus for first units and additional units. or, are there repair funds for housing or risk mitigation? But, we ended up seeing the housing search time reduced anywhere from 17% all the way up to 42%. So this works. It makes an incredible impact. It reduces the length of time that a family has to stay in shelter by not merely days, but potentially weeks. And that has so many, not only financial benefits for programs and systems, but the human benefit of just really getting people to a place where they can have respite, where they can start to heal, they can start to recover, and they can start to think about and plan for the future and self-sufficiency. So the biggest challenge with establishing a housing location infrastructure and implementing proven landlord engagement strategies is funding. So today we are going to be talking about state and federal resources that can be used to build capacity and infrastructure and implement proven landlord engagement strategies. Starting with state resources. Now, I think many of us are familiar with PHARE, the State Housing Trust Fund administered by PHFA. This resource is funded up to $60 million annually through the realty transfer tax, and a great number of homeless assistance providers and COCs have already been using PHARE to fund projects for landlord engagement and landlord incentives. Earlier this month, the 2024 awards were announced with, by my account, at least 15 unique projects that were specifically for housing location focused on landlord engagement for families and individuals overcoming homelessness. Just to remind folks, the application for PHARE opens annually around September. And if folks don't know already, the Housing Alliance is seeking to see the $60 million cap on PHARE raised yet again. So the House has passed a bipartisan bill increasing PHARE up to $100 million, and Senate, and there is also a bill in Senate Urban Affairs. We also know Governor Shapiro has, put into his budget request an increase to PHARE as well. So one thing that we are doing is we do have a sign-on letter for organizations who would support increasing PHARE, and we will be sharing that at the end of the presentation. So if you haven't signed on to that already and you plan on doing landlord engagement, I strongly recommend you help us get more funding for it. Now, I would like to introduce Amy Seacrest from PHFA to talk about another program they administer that maybe not all of you know about as much as well, and it's specific to homelessness services. So Amy, I am passing it over to you.
Great, thank you, Gail. So as Gail mentioned, I'm Amy Seacrest. I'm a senior policy officer at PHFA. And previously was managing Home for Good, although I've passed it back to my colleague Clay. He also runs the PHARE program, so probably a lot of you are familiar with him, but he was unable to attend today, so I am standing in. So today we're going to talk about the Home for Good program and opportunities for landlord engagement. So we can go to the next slide. A little background, it's a partnership between PHFA, which is a state affiliated agency. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with us, but we run a number of different programs. We're on kind of the development side, low income housing tax credits. We have mortgage products and are in the home ownership space. We do, HUD certified housing counseling. So we kind of have all different programs. But today we'll be obviously talking about Home for Good. And then Home for Good is a partnership with the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh. Next slide. So Home for Good, as I said, a collaborative initiative, and it is intended to be a flexible source of funding for organizations working to address homelessness in Pennsylvania, with the primary objective of ensuring that if an individual faces homelessness, that it is rare, brief, and non-recurring. And Functionally, it ends up plugging a lot of holes in terms of being a more flexible funding pool. So where HUD funding might have a lot more restrictions on it, Home for Good is usually used as kind of that, like I said, hole filler for where there's gaps in different COC strategies. It's a 1-month grant term, so they are pretty quick grants. And this year we will be awarding $5.25 million. The amount went up a little bit from previous years. It kind of fluctuates from year to year depending, mostly on what the Federal Home Loan Bank is able to provide. But since 2018, we've been able to distribute $23 million across 250 individual awards. So a small program compared to PHARE, but one that we're still really happy to have around. Next slide. So how the program ends up funding projects, we have 3 different funding priorities that you can see here on the screen. These end up being prevention and diversion, innovative solutions, so that's a pretty broad category, and then critical need. We're looking at really needs that the COC has determined through partnership, through planning, that are incredibly critical to meet in the community. So as you can see, these are a little bit more broad categories, like I mentioned, than maybe some other funding streams that have more specific uses for funds. Next. So yeah, I just wanted to bring up that landlord programs could fall under any of these 3, depending on how you wanted to write your grant application. Next. So before we get into kind of the actual logistics of, application, I just wanted to mention a few examples of how Home for Good has been used in terms of creating landlord-specific programming. This one is from 2022 in Erie City and County COC, and they were using the Home for Good funds to create an incentive for landlords, which looked kind of like a signing bonus for landlords that took clients that were in HUD programs. So this just created a little additional incentive to try to entice landlords to join into the program and to house folks. And I believe as of the closing of this grant, or maybe just the most recent progress report, they were able to retain, I think, about 10 landlords in their program, as well as add, I think, 6 new landlords. So again, these are smaller, but as we know, that impact can be huge just by having 6 additional landlords that are interested in housing folks that might be usually considered harder to house. Next. So this landlord engagement program is from the Eastern PA COC in the Lehigh area. So again, a similar type of program where there are incentives, signing bonuses for different units for landlords that agree to house folks who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. But there are also some really interesting, more like engagement focused parts of this grant that included creating landlord workshops, as well as programming around like how to be a good tenant, educational videos and things like that. So again, these are pretty small programs, $20,000, but they were able to create some really interesting engagement materials that, is helpful in bringing more landlords into kind of the universe of folks that we're working with. Next slide. So this is just to point out, and these slides should be available. This is a link, but all of the information about, if you're an eligible organization, eligible funding activities, all the nitty-gritty stuff that you might want to get into, it's available on our website. Our website is pretty difficult to navigate, I will admit. So if you go to PHFA's home screen and scroll down to the bottom, the very bottom of the page, Home for Good information should be found on the right side, way at the bottom. So that's probably the easiest way to find it, or Googling Home for Good PHFA. And right now the application is available to review. Next slide. So application process, nothing new here, nothing that crazy. Application period is currently open. We'll be accepting applications through July 31st. There is a review and a selection period, contracting and disbursement, ongoing reporting. The one thing that's really important to note here is that we have switched to a block grant style for the past 3 years or so, really since the pandemic, where in past years, if you were an individual organization, say you're a nonprofit looking to start one of these programs, you would apply directly to the program. We've now switched to a block grant where applications are running through your COC. So we're receiving applications from the COCs where they've already outlined, this is where we would like to spend our money. This is how we would like to use the funds from the Home for Good program. And then when we are doing our review, we're really just looking to make sure the COC, what they proposed, aligns with our requirements, eligibility, things like that. So if you are interested in applying for this funding round, you really should be talking to and in communication with your continuum of care, as they are the ones who will actually fill out the application and get that information to us. Next slide. So as I mentioned, July 31st is our deadline for applications. Again, COCs are the ones responsible for identifying and selecting projects in the region that need funding. So you should be in touch with them. And then COCs will submit kind of their application package to us on that July 31st date. So if you're interested, I would say get in touch with your COC as soon as possible. They might have their own application process where you would actually submit an application, or it might be part of a larger planning process. Just since we have it here, the application for the COC does include kind of a narrative of sorts and then a worksheet of projects, which again is where we're outlining what individual projects are being funded by that COC. Next slide. Okay, so any questions? I see from Daniel, what kind of landlord engagement events did you hold? So the example that I gave was not something that we specifically held, so it'd be a question for the organization listed there. I believe they had some workshops for landlords, but we're the funder, so we're giving out the funds to do these events, and how they actually end up happening really depends on the community and the organization that's running the event. Any other questions? I know that was very quick. Let's see.
No worries, and we'll have questions at the end as well. So okay. Let's go ahead and move on real quick and go to Brandon Allman from DCED.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Brendan Allman. I am the Homeless Program Manager at the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. Thank you all for being here today, and for the Housing Alliance for having me. I'm going to talk about some of the programs that DCED has at the state level that can help support housing and homelessness initiatives. We have a lot of programs that really help with community and economic development, but in our Center for Community and Housing Development, we currently administer a lot of the HUD-funded programs like the Emergency Solutions Grant, the Community Development Block Grant, and Home Investment Partnerships. I'm going to be focusing specifically today on ESG and Home American Rescue Plan, or HOME ARP, that has recently come out. But all of these programs can assist with some form of housing and services in your community. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So starting with the Emergency Solutions Grant, this is, again, a HUD-funded program that helps to rehouse people who are literally homeless, prevent homelessness, provide services for those who might be living on the street, and support emergency shelters and their operations, and some data entry. So DCD, as the recipient of these funds for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we typically get an annual allocation of about $5.9 million. That did go up a little bit this year. So we will have a competitive application opening up here in the near future. You can see at the bottom there, we anticipate our next round of applications opening up in July, so just a few short weeks away. We typically have that application period open between 6 and 8 weeks to receive applications. Eligible applicants for this program are units of local government, so that can be your county, township, municipality, borough, who are applying to deliver services themselves or on behalf of nonprofits in your community who want to deliver these services. We do allow for nonprofits to apply directly for our program as long as they're implementing regional projects or regional applications. And what that generally looks like is you're serving more than one county with the services. So if you have a rapid rehousing program, you might have 2 counties where you are providing those services in. So the eligible activities under the Emergency Solutions Grant program are rapid rehousing, which is rehousing folks who are literally homeless or living in shelter. preventing homelessness through homelessness prevention, outreach, and engagement of those folks to keep them in their current living situation. Support the emergency shelter operations, so that could be rent, utilities, maintenance, providing those essential services to folks in the shelter to plan on how you can quickly exit them, and some renovations costs as well. There is street outreach, so that is delivering critical needs services to those folks who are living on the streets, in their vehicles, abandoned buildings, under bridges, et cetera, and really bringing the services to them, and helping them plan for entering shelter or permanent housing situations. There is money for homeless management information system, so that could be hardware, software costs, or data entry, and that time associated with ensuring you are tracking your data, and there's some admin costs. So just a couple really high level requirements of the program. There is a match requirement, which is 100% of your grant award. That can be cash or in-kind match, but there is a 100% match requirement. You are required to use your local continuums of care coordinated entry and HMIS databases for services. And there's some other regulations. And if you want to read more into what those look like, our 2023 guidelines are posted on DCD's website. I would encourage you to take a look at those to get a sense on what really the requirements are of the program. But just note again, our 24 application should be opening up here shortly. So next slide, please. So as Amy said, some of the HUD programs aren't they aren't flexible, and honestly, we have to follow the regulations set forth by HUD. So there doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility in terms of what we can serve, and what the funds can be used for. But you can get creative, and some of these solutions include housing search and placement services for folks who are entering your rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention programs. More so for rapid rehousing, you might have some rare instances where you would need to use this in homelessness prevention, but primarily for rapid rehousing. So these are housing location services that you're providing folks who are enrolling into your program. And this can be looking for and locating obtainable and stable housing that would meet the housing's affordability needs. So it could be for these services assessing housing barriers and needs to address those barriers to maintain that stable housing, create an action plan or individualized case management housing plan that the client can follow through with to ensure that they are able to obtain and maintain their stable housing. Outreach and negotiation with landlords. I mean, this is that critical piece that is often missing, and having those clients have an advocate for them to reach out to those landlords and have that conversation as to how this program benefits not only the participant but also the landlord, that there is this ongoing support for that client and just being that voice that they typically need. We can assist with providing those rental applications, and helping the client to understand what is in the lease and how to support them in maintaining and following those lease agreements. And they can also support the application fees that are included with that. Part of the requirement for providing these rental subsidies is that they must meet HUD's housing quality standards, habitability quality standards for inspections. So they have to be up to code and suitable. And under this category of supportive services, you're able to inspect the unit for compliance before signing that lease agreement, helping them to get utilities in their name and supporting them through that effort, and providing that just general housing counseling. I will just note there is a slight difference in this housing search and counseling as it relates to holistic case management versus HUD approved housing counseling services. So if you have someone who is a HUD housing counselor, you need a very specific certification for that to be able to provide those housing counseling. But if it's part of just holistic case management, you're just doing that outreach and support and negotiating with the landlords, maintaining a database of units to quickly move your clients into housing. That is a little bit different, but I just want to make sure that is noted. And if you're doing that whole really specific HUD housing counseling, you do need a specific certification for that. There's also some costs eligible for transportation in terms of getting clients to those units to make sure that it meets their needs, reviewing them and ensuring that that is somewhere where they truly want to live. Next slide, please. I'll just note one more thing before going into home ARP. Some other really creative, or maybe not really creative, but other options under the rapid rehousing programs and homelessness prevention is you can provide up to 2 times the amount of the security deposit and pay first and last month's rent with this program. So that is just another way to kind of incentivize landlords for working with these clients as they're getting, this money up front to really entice them. There's not much flexibilities built in as far as incentives or bonuses yet. I'm hoping that will change here in the near future with the new ESG final rule coming out from the federal government, and maybe including some new bonuses there. But right now, we can provide up to that 2 times the security deposit and first and last month's rent. So just going into the Home American Rescue Plan, or ARP program that's being administered through DCED. This funding was created in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where the Commonwealth, DCED, received $73 million to develop and support housing for qualifying populations. So you'll see the breakdown of what was included in that $73 million to help this administer these funds and these initiatives. We did have a pretty lengthy public comment period where we developed an action plan that was submitted and approved by HUD that really inform the breakdown of these categories. So supportive services, there'll be about $11.5 million. Affordable rental housing development, there'll be $35 million available for award. That is going to be done in partnership with PHFA. They've partnered with us in our annual home program for many years to help with the administration of that development of new funds, and they'll continue that. There's non-congregate shelter development that is eligible. That's about $15.5 million, and that's acquisition, conversion, and rehab to create non-congregate shelter. And then there's some admin and planning dollars as well. But today, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the supportive services aspect of this program. Next slide, please. So under Home ARP supportive services, we did select, based on our consultations and action plan, specific items that would be eligible under this program for supportive services, including housing search and counseling services, mental health services, transportation, case management, financial assistance, and short and medium term financial assistance for rent. So this program was really modeled off of the Emergency Solutions Grant program, since the HOME program is more into that housing development, and existing owner rehab is primarily what DCD has focused on with this program. But under Home ARP, it did allow for these flexibilities to really work with tenants to ensure they are able to access housing and maintain that housing. So everything that I mentioned under the Emergency Solutions Grant in terms of what is eligible for housing search and counseling applies here under Home ARP. So we encourage you to look at that. We do have our guidelines out, and if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about qualifying populations here, or supportive services rather. So we did have the application that opened up on May 28th for supportive services with a deadline of July 26th at 5 p.m. Applications must be submitted through DCD's electronic single application, which you can find the link here on this slide, or if you just go to our website, you'll be able to search for that. As far as applying for these supportive services funds, it is open, again, to units of local governments and nonprofits. The only difference here is nonprofits do not have to provide a regional project. You're able to apply directly to support your community that you're in and your service area. So under this program, it doesn't need to be regional. I'll just note a little caveat. In order to be able to apply, you must have a consultation meeting with one of our Home ARP grant managers. Basically what they'll do is they'll hear what you're interested in applying for, and help prepare you for submitting an application to make sure that your program is eligible, you're meeting some of our guidelines and requirements that are needed, and just overall help you submit a better application. Another note that we've been getting some questions on that I wanted to make sure I noted here is one of the requirements is you must have a written agreement with your local continuum of care to utilize their coordinated entry system. So what this basically means is, I know in a lot of COCs, and especially I would point to the Eastern PA COC, they have an agreement that agencies sign to say that they will follow the Eastern COC's coordinated entry policies and procedures, and that they will accept referrals from the coordinated entry system to serve those folks with their programs. So there is a written agreement. If you don't have something like that in place, I would contact your local continuum of care now to see what that may look like, what kind of agreement they have in place. If they are in need of one, I can provide you with the template that the East uses that can be modified to fit your local continuums of care need. But that is one of the requirements of the program, with some small exceptions. If there's something really extenuating that would prevent you from using coordinated entry, I believe they will accept a waiver, but primarily they're looking for you to use coordinated entry. Next slide, please. So I just listed some resources here. If you want to check out the HOME ARP notice that went out, our allocation plan is in there, and then a link to PHFA's website, who again will be working with us on the affordable housing development aspect of this program. Next slide. And there's my contact information. And again, if you are interested in hosting or having a consultation meeting, please email that email address. You can copy me on it as well to make sure it gets to the right hands. But that's how you will schedule your consultation meeting with our HOME ARP team. So thank you. I think there were some questions in the chat. I don't know if we're going to look at them now or wait until the end, but I appreciate you all listening in, and please contact me with any other questions.
Great, thank you. I think it's really opportune that we're having this webinar, this virtual summit right now, because these applications are open. We really do want to make sure that you are aware of these opportunities and are aware of how you can braid these resources together so that, where there isn't flexibility with the federal resources and the state resources, you can, use some of the more flexible stuff in that way. So I do just want to remind folks, if you could please put your questions into the Q&A versus the chat. It just makes it a lot easier for me, the moderator, to facilitate. And then next up, we have Joe Savage to tell us, there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of pandemic-related resources. There's been a lot of changes with regulations, and things are going to be changing again as we are starting to see a lot of those pandemic resources hit their expiration dates. So really excited to have Joe here to tell us what we should be keeping an eye on.
All right, thank you so much. I'm on my iPad, so I can't see my face, but can you all see my face? Is my camera on?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks for having me again on this webinar with you all. And what I want to do is I just want to briefly highlight what we see communities doing as it relates to landlord engagement in terms of the funding that they are using, and then talk specifically about ESG and COC funding. And Brandon covered a lot of this, so I'll just touch on them briefly and then just add some caveats as far as federal priorities are concerned. So the first thing that I'll start out saying is that for the most part, and when it comes down to landlord engagement, and this is everything from bonuses to incentives to repairs, mediation, etc., a lot of what communities are doing, they are using local, state, philanthropic, and other non-federal resources. Those are the sources that are carrying the bulk of the funding when it comes down to landlord engagement. And some of the things that we're seeing communities do, you've heard about bonuses, You've heard about incentives, but also using these resources to provide landlords with rental payments when the unit is vacant, with an agreement that they will allow that unit to be rented to a household that is experiencing homelessness, as well as also using dollars to help support property managers and affordable housing developers in the actual development of affordable housing. And an example of that is in Tampa, Florida, where they're using housing trust fund dollars to give affordable housing developers and lump sum upfront payment to go towards the cost, with a guarantee that they will rent a certain amount of units to households that are experiencing homelessness. And so two of the primary sources, and as I mentioned, Brandon already talked about this, two of the primary sources are ESG and COC funding. And I'll be honest with you, there is very limited amount of dollars that can be used between these two sources as it relates to landlord engagement. Brandon already talked about, as far as COC funding is concerned, with security deposits as well as first and last month's rent, and that security deposit not to exceed 2 months. It can also be used for mediation between landlords and tenants. And then there's ESG funding, which has a very limited amount under housing search and placement, where, as Brandon mentioned, it can be used for outreach to and negotiation with landlords. So as I mentioned, the majority of the sources that communities are using are non-federal dollars, and there's very limited dollars that you can use COC and ESG funding for as it relates to landlord incentives, bonuses, engagement, and things of that nature. Now, the one thing that I did want to point out, I do have on here HUD's notice CPD 21-08, and many of you may be familiar with this notice. This notice essentially gave additional flexibilities to use ESG CV funds for landlord engagement. And these are some of the things: signing bonuses not to exceed 2 months of rent, security deposits not to exceed 3 months of rent, in addition to the security deposit that is allowed under COC funding, paying the cost to repair units incurred by recipients that's not covered by the security deposit, and then paying extra costs for cleaning or maintenance of the program participants' unit. So under this particular notice, communities were given additional flexibilities that really expanded what they could do with ESG funding. Now, most communities have expended these dollars, and these are the specific dollars that were administered under the CARES Act during COVID, specifically relating to ESG funding. So if most communities have expended these dollars, why did I put this on this slide? The reason why I put this on this slide, and this goes into something else that Brandon mentioned, we are currently in the process, and not just currently, we've been doing it for quite some time. We've been looking at a number of the flexibilities and waivers that communities were given, whether it was through COC funding, ESG funding, even down to basic HUD requirements and regulations, etc. We've been looking at many of those waivers and flexibilities, and we have been examining what would it take to allow that waiver or that particular flexibility to become something that is permanent. And so I encourage you all, as you go about your work, as you go about your advocacy, and you come across your HUD officials, HUD representatives, etc., let them know how much this flexibility, as it related to the ESG funding, how much it really helped increase the supply of rental housing in your community because of these flexibilities. Because as Brandon mentioned, the ESG final rule has not yet come out. And as I mentioned, we are considering looking at what would it take to have a number of these flexibilities and these waivers become permanent. So you could see that once the final rule is released, that these flexibilities that you were able to have with the ESG CV funding may become permanent flexibilities with quote unquote regular ESG funding. And essentially, one of the biggest things that we heard from communities when it came down to landlord engagement was the ability to do these additional things and provide these incentives and these bonuses for landlords. And it really helped bring them on board. And I believe it was Gail who mentioned in her opening remarks, for a lot of landlords, particularly in many communities, they're dealing with mom and pop landlords. And essentially, these units are their lifeline. These units are their retirement. It is their income. And so really being able to have these flexibilities can really help them feel more secure financially when it comes down to renting to households that are experiencing homelessness. Something creative that I've seen some communities do as far as landlord engagement is concerned, using this funding to hire a single point of contact that is solely responsible for landlord recruitment and retention. And something that they've done in terms of hiring this individual, they would hire someone with a real estate background, and that person with the real estate background could really serve as a bridge between the homeless provider and the landlords, because they could speak the landlord's language. Because a lot of times engaging landlords, you got to speak in terms of dollars, operations, and flow, etc. They would hire someone with a real estate background who could speak to the landlords and speak in their language. And that was something that we've seen in many communities, and they have been very successful in recruiting landlords. And then also ensuring that when you're using these sources to support landlord engagement, making sure that it's something that is ongoing, not just ongoing recruitment efforts, whether it's quarterly or biannually, but even once you get landlords on board, making sure that you're doing something annually to celebrate them, doing something annually to keep them on board and to retain them. So as I mentioned, most communities are using non-federal sources to support their landlord engagement. There is limited dollars in terms of what you can do with COC funding as well as ESG funding. But hopefully, and again, through your advocacy, you may be able to see some of these flexibilities that were allowed under ESG CV. You may see some of those flexibilities become permanent. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Is there any opportunity right now to start to weigh in and get our advocacy going and saying we really do need to keep these flexibilities?
So Gail, that is a great question. Technically, I am not allowed to tell you all to advocate. I will just say, if you come across an opportunity where you can reach out to someone at HUD, be it your local HUD field office, you're at a conference, you see someone with a HUD name badge, stop them and have a conversation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. And next we have, I'm going to stop actually sharing my screen.
No, yeah, Gail, you're good to keep sharing from your room. That's fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Next, we have Kaylin Charlton from Truist, who is going to talk about how do we leverage CRA for landlord incentives. And as I mentioned earlier, Truist gave us a small amount of money that we were able to use to pilot landlord incentives in 3 different communities. And, we saw really, really interesting things happen. People were able to just make modest improvements to their buildings, whether it was, buying a new toilet or, maybe doing some extra pest control or, helping to repair another unit that they plan to rent to a program. And, all of these folks tended to be small businesses. So it was really interesting to not only see the impact that it had, but also to use what is often maybe not seen as a go-to resource for landlord incentives for homelessness service programs. So very excited to have you here, Kaylin.
Cool. Well, thank you, Gail. And again, I'm Kalen Charlton. I'm the CRA program manager for Truist. What I will say, I've been with the bank for almost a little bit over a decade now. Most of that has been in community development, CRA. Did do a stint in underwriting and credit, but just to let you all know that are in Pennsylvania, I did serve in the state with two nonprofits in Philadelphia doing community development lending. So have some roots up there in the Philadelphia market, and it has a special place in my heart. I always try to connect with those that I talk to in Pennsylvania on that aspect. So just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to share more about the Community Reinvestment Act. Some may be familiar with this part of regulation and banking, and this is really to help explain how your organizations can engage banks for CRA purposes. So next slide, Gail. So first, I'd like to share that Truist purpose is to inspire and build better lives and communities. Our purpose is the foundation for everything we do. Every word it was chosen very carefully when we came up with this purpose. And for me, community is what brings it all full circle, and feeling that sense of connection and doing this critical work together. I mean, I know we got a lot of folks from the government, a lot of nonprofits on the call today, and really it is that sense of doing this work together, because we can't do it alone. Our commitment to Pennsylvania goes well beyond the business that we conduct. It's really about investing in the well-being and progress of the people in the neighborhoods that we serve there and their unique needs. I will say we totally recognize that there are barriers to economic stability for many of our individuals in the Pennsylvania regions and Pennsylvania region, but as well as the communities that where we are. We cannot stress enough the importance of helping break down those barriers to provide individuals the opportunities and vital resources like affordable housing to reach their full potential, and in turn help our communities reach their full potential. So to achieve this goal, Truist is proud to support a broad array of nonprofits and organizations that align with our purpose. The reason, as Gail mentioned here today, why I'm here is because of one of the ways that we partnered with HAPA. But before I get into how we partnered with HAPA, and I know Gail shared it just earlier, I do want to spend some time talking about the Community Reinvestment Act for those that may not be familiar, just for a general overview. Then I can talk about how organizations can align their programs and solutions to lean into banks and their CRA strategies. So hopefully from this general knowledge and you'll gain some vocabulary, but also know where to do some research and really who to reach out to and how that may align for a lot of the homeless initiatives that you may have within your community. So what is CRA? It started back in 1977. It's to help communities meet it's for banks in order to help communities meet their credit needs as well as the community needs, and mainly supporting low and moderate income individuals and communities, as well as small businesses. Point blank, what it really helps to do is say, hey, where are banks taking deposits and making loans, and where do they need to reinvest those types of resources within their communities? A lot of that's dictated and guided by an area's demographic, and that's focused on income levels. So you'll hear y'all that are in you'll have guidelines for those that you serve. I would say typically for income, same thing applies to CRA, and it's really looking at that low and moderate demographic, as well as the small businesses within our markets as well. So that's the general idea of CRA and what needs to be done, and where banks need to reinvest and reallocate the resources that they have. But the way that they do that and where that falls underneath is really three primary buckets, and that's where banks are held accountable for their community development activities and CRA activities. So how's that evaluated for banks? It's done in three ways. It's under three different tests: the lending test, the investment test, and the service test. Don't want to get too much in the weeds of these, but really this is to help guide some of the conversations and where you may be looking to engage banks, not just for landlord initiatives, but other ways in your community to meet their needs. So for the lending test, it examines how a bank is making loans, really to support mortgages and small business loans, as well as community development loans. So think of community development loans as far as, hey, did you come to the bank and we were able to do a loan that supported a homeless shelter? That's an example of that. The next test is going to be the investment test, and that's really where probably this conversation that we're talking about today is where you would want to engage banks, and that's really on their philanthropic side, the grant side, but it's also where banks are evaluated on their equity placements, through LIHTC or low-income housing tax credit programs. So that's, I'll get into some of the aspects that here in a second of how that level of engagement can happen. The last thing that banks are held accountable to and evaluated on is going to be the service test. And that's really where our banking products and our services are seen as being accessible to the communities that we serve. So it looks at where our branches are, the way that we offer our services through digital channels, but one bit component here is also how we engage the community through volunteerism and being really able to offer nonprofits in the community financial education, board availability and board services. So that's really where the service test gets evaluated on. But at the bottom here, I've got some examples of what that may look like, because we said the CRA looks at all different types of income levels and how banks are doing when it comes to low and moderate income people, realizing that looks different in urban areas versus more rural areas. This is an example of that, but really where our focus are those individuals and communities where the area median income is less than 80%. So just to give you, I know a lot of the organizations, they already look at income verification for the programs, but this is when you're talking through the relationships and partnerships that you want to have with banks, this is probably where I would say to put your to really talk through that. But I will say homelessness, if you have programs focused on homelessness, that's something that underneath the CRA is qualifiable and counts for CRA purposes all day long. So next slide. So how can CRA be leveraged for your organization's housing and community development solutions? I know today we're really talking about landlord incentives, and I can get into that here in a second of where we partnered with the Housing Alliance. But this is to give you an idea of where you can engage banks in your community. And the one that I hear the most often is this first one, is really around the grant funding. And this is one way. These are several ways that you can approach it when it comes to affordable housing. You can look at having grants support rapid rehousing, voucher-based type of programming, homeless programming. Really, it's around there getting people into units that they can afford. When it comes to an array of different ways of providing housing. The second one's going to be for small businesses. This is like, Gail had mentioned earlier, we've partnered with, or we've taken like a two-pronged approach when it came to housing and landlords. We look primarily at how to help the landlords build their capacity and their experience with offering more affordable units and how to keep them affordable or repair them and gain access to affordable credit to make those repairs. The next one where you can engage banks philanthropically on the grant side around those community service needs. So, childcare, healthy food, job placement, workforce, that's one area. And then the last one is going to be really around revitalization, stabilization. This may not apply to some of the folks on the call today, but this is really looking at your distressed areas that you may have and being able to, bring in jobs, bring in, if there's a disaster, to be able to respond to disasters and really make an impact on the community. So that's philanthropic grants, and the next part is volunteerism and ways that you can engage employees at a bank. And really, there's a couple things. Really, we want to be able to use our knowledge in order to help those that you serve. So that can be through financial education. When we talk about financial education, it's how can you budget? What's the basics of banking? How do you open up a bank account? What can you do to avoid fees? And what could be the best checking option for you? Not sales related. This is all just general education for low and moderate income folks. But understanding credit, fraud awareness. We've worked with several senior populations where fraud has been prevalent, and we have workshops where we can offer ways that they can mitigate their exposure to fraud and be more aware of it. And then the other one that we talked through is home ownership a lot. But when you have these conversations with banking folks, talk to them about how they can offer workshops to those that you serve. But also, if they have someone that sits on your board, that is also a good way to build those relationships and in order, to talk through that philanthropic relationship or talk to other ways that the banks can help meet the needs of your community. The last one I'll talk through is as far as talking to banks is around the lending investment needs that you may have. And this is really around, hey, is there a debt need that landlords may have? Is there a debt need that your nonprofits may have? And really that plays into probably a bigger relationship there when you're developing that. But that's another way that when you're talking and engaging banks is to talk through, hey, this can help towards CRA, and tell them why. It supports affordable housing. It's supporting a new kitchen that we're trying to expand and get equipment for homeless services that we may provide. So all in all, focus on, I would say the big thing here when we're talking about the landlord's incentives, where we played a part with the Housing Alliance was on that philanthropic side as well as volunteerism. We've had, exceptional folks that have sat on the board with the Housing Alliance, and with that, the other three organizations that Gail alluded to that we supported, being able to have teammates offer financial education workshops to the clients that they serve directly. So next slide, please, Gail. So now that I've covered what CRA is. Some of y'all may have already known about that. This is the way that we got involved with HAPA. Is we had that relationship, and we've had our purpose really is going back to knowing what the community needs are from a CRA perspective and being able to respond to them. This was a need when it came to landlord incentives, but landlord capacity to offer more affordable housing, but as well as growing their ability to have better access to flexible capital. We kept hearing that, and this is one way that we partnered to address that need. So we kept hearing the need, and we've partnered with the Housing Alliance for almost a 3-year period in order to address this need. This goes back to 2021. The strategy originally, I think, was to expand more capital for landlords to do small loan repair. But through the conversations that we had, and more of what the ground level strategy was, it was to be able to respond with these incentives to support both the landlords and their LMI needs. So accomplishing this is more than about checks that we write. It's a question of impact and how is the world a better place because of our support. And I look back on there's 26 new 26 new landlords now in Pennsylvania that offer or accept vouchers. Now there's 55 families that now have a place to have a home, and it's really because of these voucher units. But the landlords themselves have had impactful stories. I think Gail alluded to someone's going to go buy a new toilet for their unit and fix it up. That story was incredibly impactful, just because the landlord themselves had been homeless and really wanted to do all they could for reinvesting their dollars and offering through their properties. And they wanted to know how they could do more of that type of improvements. And this type of relationship that we had through CRA has been able to do that. So what's the best way that your organization can leverage this and look at it? First, I would say, all banks' CRA evaluations are public. That's what holds us accountable to meeting the needs and saying how we're doing within the area. So you can look those up. They're made public, and those will be made public usually every 3 to 5 years, depending on who regulates that bank. But when you're going through those evaluations, look at your state, look at your area, see what the bank is doing from their grants and their investments that they're making within your area. And that way you have, whenever you start to engage, you have a footing of what's is going on and who they're working with. So who would you contact, right? That's going to be I would say you start with your CRA community development officers that are within the area. We have one that serves in Pennsylvania as well as New Jersey, and happy to put y'all in contact as y'all engage Truist. But several other banks have these positions that you can talk to and lean into your philanthropic relationship with them in ways that you can partner. But the other ones you can engage with are your local branch and commercial leadership. It depends on how the banks are. But if you already have a relationship with the bank, talk to them and like, hey, what do y'all do in CRA? Some other things that other channels that you can go through are going to be your low-income housing tax credit teams. They will have a relationship manager typically. Same thing with new market tax credits. While that may not be related to housing exactly, and more economic development, there can be aspects there to engage for other community needs. The other thing too, the last one is bank foundations. See who you can get to there. If some of the funding channels may not typically, some of the funding channels don't align, but there's another way to do that. But I will say that Truist is proud to stand with HAPA and the initiative partners that Gail shared and celebrate their work and, you know, making affordable housing more accessible and working with landlords. It's not easy. We're a small piece of the pie, but we're doing all that we can to, you know, hear the needs of our communities and address that to have a stronger community for our low and moderate income folks. So thank you for allowing me to come alongside you all at HAPA and as well as within the state to make the difference in the lives of individuals that we serve in Pennsylvania. So Gail, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask all of our amazing speakers to come on camera. And now we get to the really good part, which is the Q&A. So our first question is from Tom, and this is related to Home for Good, using funds for damage and vacancy mitigation funds. You would need to hold funds for more than 1 year. Is that something that you can do with Home for Good?
You know, that's a really good specific question that I might not have the perfect answer to right now. I'd have to go back and double check. I know that the grants generally need to be closed after a year, which would include, you know, expending those funds, although I do think in the past we have been somewhat flexible to those types of kind of holding funds, like a landlord risk mitigation pool. So it just gets a little bit specific. So I think it's one of those things that, especially with the bank partner, that's where like they have more requirements on how their funds get used than we do. So if you have something, a project specifically, I would say shoot us an email and we can definitely make sure we get you an answer that is fully up to code.
I do know with PHARE, oftentimes when it comes to like mitigation funds, and we encourage people to ask for a no-cost extension. Is that something that would be
Yeah, we've
allowable for Home
definitely
for Good?
done them in PHARE, but again, I think because of the bank being involved and kind of their requirements to their members, I don't want to speak out of turn and say that we can do that when we might not be able to. PHARE is all more money that we manage, so we have a little bit more flexibility in that.
Great. As for homeless prevention, what does that look like? I ask because I have a client who owns her own home, but taxes have piled up, especially after losing income and COVID. Is there something your grants can help with?
If that's for Home for Good, it's really dependent on your COC and how they would like to use the funds for prevention. So I think as far as our understanding of prevention, there would definitely be something that could address that type of situation, but it would come in through the COC. So it would really depend on how your COC is thinking about using those funds. But as far as kind of the general, you know, it would probably be fine in terms of using it for prevention in that kind of scenario. But it would need to be connected under Home for Good to a specific probably funding program, which again then becomes, how does your COC think about prevention?
But PHFA in general has like homeownership preservation programs, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And how would folks find those?
So that would depend. So I would go to our website and there's a section for homeowners. We have a variety of different kind of programs for helping if someone goes, you know, is having some issues in terms of maintaining homeownership, but usually those have to do with kind of our mortgages. So there are some specifics there, but I would recommend going to our website.
Great. So I think this might be a question for a couple of people. For the transportation costs, is this different from eligible costs allowed under emergency shelter?
Under ESG, if you're talking about what I listed under rapid rehousing and homeless prevention, no, I mean, it can be to provide those stipends or those bus tickets or whatever that may be to transport the client to services or to their rentals. It could be if in certain circumstances, if there's no taxis, using rideshare services that are available, those sort of things.
Great. Our next question is talking about the various pilot programs that have signing bonuses with landlords. Are landlords required to sign an agreement to work with the program for a certain amount of time? And if yes, how long? Same question for risk mitigation funds. Do landlords have to agree to partner for a certain period of time if they accept those funds? I'm going to go ahead and take this one since, but I will, of course, open it up to other folks to add in. I think what we've seen communities do is it's very much tied to that unique housing situation. So if you're going to get a sign-on bonus, you're probably not going to get it until the client moves into the home and there's a signed lease. And then, that's when you get the bonus. If there's going to be a vacancy hold, we have, seen communities where they pay the money up front and it's a little bit of a gamble, but that's what they do in Montgomery County, but it's, paid off well. The reward has far outweighed the risk that they're taking on, but other programs, again, may not pay the vacancy payment until after the client moves in. For risk mitigation funds, it's usually reimbursement for, damages caused or lost earnings from somebody abandoning a unit. So it's not necessarily an agreement that's signed that they have to continue to work with the program, but I think because it's such a good faith gesture that you are there, that oftentimes landlords do recognize that the client's behavior is not the agency's behavior, and the agency steps up and supports them, they're going to continue to work with the program because they're probably going to recoup more of their loss from working with a program than from not. Our next question, are there workforce ready grants for those in transitional housing or recovering addicts? I think this might be related to Kaylin. Are these types of activities that you would support?
Yeah, so that example, when it comes to those that are, when it's related to workforce and trying to do wraparound services for those that may have substance abuse or just trying to get them into a job, that does apply to CRA. And we've done cases of that and, across our footprint. Some examples that come up that we've had a big push in West Virginia to do that type of work. And but yeah, so workforce related needs for those that may be in a shelter, and then also that have substance abuse disorders that would fall underneath with what CRA can support.
Great. Is there a name for the CRA-driven developer training access to capital programs so we can push our local banks to offer them to local developers?
Their name, I'm reading through it. One thing I think is, yeah, so Tom, here's what I would say. When it comes to developer training programs, there's some that are offered through what are called CDFIs. Those are community development financial institutions. There's really strong ones within Pennsylvania. I've worked for two of them, and they're incredible. They do have some developer training programs. I'd say check with, do some research with what the Reinvestment Fund has to offer. There's Community First Fund. There's also LISC Philadelphia that's doing some of this developer training and also working with developers to build their capacity and then act. Their primary purpose is to be able to do community development lending and have more flexible capital for affordable housing and community projects. So there's a way to look at that. It's going to depend on what each community or each CDFI, the community development financial institutions, offer, but they are out there. I'd reference to what they do individually.
Great. I think we have another CRA question. Can this fund be used to contract with specific types of law outside of legal aid, MidPen, for folks that are not able to find the type of landlord-tenant law they need to assist them? Actually, the person who wrote that question, if you could just add a little bit more context of what it is that you're asking for, and we'll come back to you. And then we have a question around, I think it's the Housing Assistance Fund through PHFA, the big pandemic related one. Is that still open and taking applications?
I am not the right person to ask about that.
Okay.
But if you drop your email, or if you want to shoot me an email, I can connect you to the right person.
Let's see. Can we use
I'll just go
CRA?
back to the legal services question, and just
Okay.
note that ESG services can support legal services and working with attorneys, as long as it's related to addressing barriers that may be preventing them from accessing housing. So in a lot of cases, it wouldn't be able to support things like, custody of children, but really more housing focused legal issues that are coming up, like eviction notices, for example. So ESG can support that through our services.
Quick follow-up question. What about legal services related to maybe accessing benefits and, helping to leverage those resources that essentially increase income?
Yeah, we have seen that before. We did fund a project out of Philadelphia where the attorney was supporting clients who were, in very certain circumstances. I think it was maybe related to homelessness prevention, supporting those clients with accessing those mainstream benefits. So we have seen that before.
Great. Another question, do any of the programs that we discussed today support master leasing agreements and programs? I know in reviewing the PHARE awards just this month, I know there's at least one master leasing project in there.
Yeah, and ESG can support that as well.
And I'm sure Home for Good can as well. But again, that's one of those, that gets into the more specific, innovative kind of approaches where the bank does have a say on that.
And COC funding.
Can we use CRA bank funding to aid or replace and man the kitchen and recreation areas for shelters, involving those in housing for recovery?
Yes, I mean that's a simple. Yeah, if you have a program that supports a homeless population, that aligns perfectly with CRA being able to respond to that type of need. Yes.
Great. So we just have a couple minutes left. So I really want to say thank you to our panel for just giving really robust information. And again, remind folks, applications are open for Home for Good. Applications are open for HOME ARP. The NOFO is going to be, do you have a sense when the NOFO is going to be dropping, Joe?
this summer.
This summer.
Could
We
be
always
any
wanted-
day now, could be a week
Yeah.
from
Soon, very soon, a NOFO is coming to a community near you for housing for homeless assistance programs. And so, you know, I'm thinking about how do you braid all of these resources together? Because no one resource is going to be able to do it alone. But if you can look at the entire map of resources and say, like, FARE is really good for the landlord incentives. We want FARE for the risk mitigation, but maybe we want Home for Good for the sign-on bonuses. And then, you know, we're going to use ESG and COC funding to pay for the actual staff time, that devoted capacity. And then, you know, maybe we could start a preferred landlord program that's going to have like grants for home improvements that we get from CRA. So there's a lot of potential if we know how to maximize each of the resources in the way that it can be most impactful. So the last thing that I want to say is, you know, these applications are going to be opening soon. Please get in contact with your local bank to see how you access their CRA and philanthropic funding. But there's also FARE. FARE has been an amazing resource for homelessness services and being flexible in the ways that government funding cannot. And we want to see more money go to FARE. We want to see that funding cap limit be increased. So I'm going to ask my coworker Jen to put a link into the chat about signing your organization on. We want to be able to show our leaders in Harrisburg that communities want this, communities need this, and share your stories about the good that you are doing with it. So on that note, it is 12:30 on the dot on my clock. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Again, thank our presenters, and we will see you next time.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.